Greetings viewers, Eric the Car Guy. Thanks for tuning in today. I have a little problem with the truck that has sort of been there ever since I completed my rebuild, and I'm finally to a point where I'm getting to it, and that is, after driving for a while, my power steering goes away. In fact, it's almost non-existent. Say I drive on the highway for a little bit and then I try to steer the wheel. Afterward, it's warmed up and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to steer. However, when you first start the truck up, power steering works fine. Initially, I had this crazy straw of a high pressure power steering line that, I feel was causing some restrictions in heating the fluid up. But I've since replaced that line. It's a more direct line directly into the steering box. And I believe I've eliminated those restrictions, yet the problem still persists. So today, I'm going to be installing this power steering cooler. This was only 20 bucks. It was rather inexpensive in hopes to solve this problem. But what I intend to do in this video is show the temperatures and everything with it the way it is now, and then show it afterwards, and also talk about my results of adding this power steering cooler and whether or not it solved this problem. So if you're having some power steering issues on a build that you've got, this may help guide you on a, hopefully economical solution to the problem. Before we get into this power steering problem that's specific to my truck, some things to check if you're having issues with your power steering system not putting out like it should. In other words, more steering effort than is necessary. Number one thing to check is the tire pressures. Make sure the tire pressures are good. Also check your suspension components to see if anything is broken, bent, or possibly binding. Also check the belt and the power steering fluid level. Make sure that the belt is tight and not slipping on the pulley, and also make sure that your power steering fluid is topped off and doesn't have a bunch of bubbles or air in it. If it does, that could indicate the problem. And lastly, I have found on rare occasion problems with the couplers in the steering column. So in other words, the parts that connect the steering column, like say U-joints or something like that, to say a power steering rack or a power steering box, I have found issues with those causing hard power steering. Now let's get into what's going on with my truck. I think the obvious thing before I start it up and run it is to check and verify the fluid level, which I have, and I know that it's good. You can see that there. So that lower mark is the full cold mark. And I think it's important that we talk about the difference between power steering fluid and automatic transmission fluid real quick. Some might be saying, hey Eric, why not take the power steering fluid that's in it now and swap it out for ATF? That could solve the problem. And though it is true that both of these are hydraulic fluids and would work to a certain extent, automatic transmission fluid is filled with what are called friction modifiers, and that is to help the components inside the automatic transmission work better. The power steering system does not have any of these components. In fact, it's really just a metal pump, and those friction modifiers could actually harm the power steering pump. Therefore, it is not a good idea to run automatic transmission fluid in your power steering system. However, if you use Type F automatic transmission fluid, which does not have friction modifiers, that could be a possibility. However, I'm going to try this power steering fluid cooler, and hopefully by the end of this video, I will show that that will solve the problem. I'm going to start with a baseline and take the temperature of the fluid both cold first after startup and also after it's run for a time before and after the installation of the cooler. I have this laser temperature probe that I picked up for like 20 bucks at Harbor Freight. I also have this thermal camera from Fleer that they sent me. This is the older model, but I actually prefer this one. But maybe this will give us a visual of what's happening with that fluid as it's in the system. All right, let's check the temperatures at the outlet. About 73, 74 degrees. Back of the pump. About 89. 88 degrees. Return line, about 79, 78. Let's see what the thermal imaging says. It's getting hot because of the exhaust there. You can see that these are really starting to heat up. Now I'm going to take it out for a drive. All right, I'm back from the drive, and the more I steer it, the more difficult it is to steer. It's up to operating temperature. It really doesn't have to be a far drive, but this is exactly what I'm experiencing. you can raise the idle, it's a little better. So raising the idle helps, but just at idle, it struggles. Let's see what the temperatures look like. 140, 150 at the inlet of the high pressure. Low pressure, actually higher, 160-ish. Back of the pump, 167, 170. So about 170 degrees on the hoses anyway. Here's how it looks on the thermal. I'm going to shut this down, let it cool for a minute, and then get ready to install the cooler. So here's the cooler I intend to install, and FYI, it happens to be a Ford power steering cooler, but it really doesn't matter. Fluid flows through it and it's going to cool, so that's that. But my intention is to mount it here to the side of the fan shroud and route the hoses and everything down there. I'm not going to cover that in detail. It's going to be specific for whatever your application is. Mostly the purpose of this video is to show you how cooling power steering fluid can help with power steering effort when it gets warm. So we'll jump back in after I get this mounted, and we'll redo our tests and temperatures and see if I win. If not, you may never see this video. Honestly, this didn't take long at all, but this is what I've ended up with. So I've got the cooler mounted there on the side of the fan shroud. And yes, I have made sure that my screws didn't interfere with the fan at all. So they're short enough, they're not coming in contact with anything, but that's fastened on securely. It's not going anywhere. This is how I routed the hose. I didn't have to trim the low pressure line coming out. I just ran it over to here, and then I ran a piece of, well, this is fuel line stuff, which should be okay for this. And this is the low pressure side, so it's not holding back any pressure, sort of through there. So you can kind of see that little S turn where that goes. So I just need to top off the fluid. I've already checked for leaks. There aren't any. And once we top off the fluid, we'll take a look at the temperatures and see if they've changed. It's still slightly warm from when I took it out, but I will take it out again and test to see if this actually solved the problem of the difficult steering after this thing warms up. Gonna start it there. Not quite to full hot, but I'm gonna drive it around and really get it hot and then recheck it. I'm gonna start it up, check for leaks one last time. All right, let's check those temps again. This is cold, remember, so I got 100 degrees on the high pressure, 97, 96, so I've got a 4-degree drop at the moment between the two coming out. There's the high pressure coming out, 116, and going in on the low side, 114. The cooler, about 110. There's the cooler. Well, let's take it out and drive it, see what it does. I'm going to show the thermal first. It would be great to see some kind of difference in those line temperatures. See a little, but not a lot. Maybe about a 20 or 30 degree difference. It is helping. Here's the real issue though. Well, it's better, but it's not great. I still got to do some effort to try to get it to steer. If I raise the idle slightly, it's better. But what if I'm trying to park a trailer and I'm trying to get fine movements out of this? It's going to be some effort. I won't sugarcoat it. The results up to this point have been less than stellar. Therefore, I've at least temporarily relocated the power steering cooler down here out of the engine compartment. Hopefully it gets more airflow. If this works out, I'm actually just going to bend this bracket over to this fastener and leave this fastened here, but it's actually fairly secure where it is. And if that does work out, I may make this line shorter, this return line, or maybe not. But I'm going to give this a try and see if this helps bring down those temperatures and makes it so that it steers easier.
The new location is better, but it's not necessarily solving the problem. So inlet temp is around 140 degrees. Outlet temp is around 90, 100, well, let's call it 100 degrees. That seems to be about the average. It is better, it is cooling, yet the problem persists.
Time for an update. I've let the truck sit overnight just to sort of think on what's going on. All of my efforts up to this point, the power steering cooler, moving the power steering cooler to a new location, have yielded 0 results. I also tried one more thing. I know I talked about fluid early on, but what I tried was, and this is not an advertisement, I tried some synthetic power steering fluid that came in a yellow bottle. Let's just call it that. And I swapped out the power steering fluid for that. The steering did improve, but the problem still is there. I've gone through the service manual from Chevrolet about the breakdown of how to diagnose this problem. They want you to install a power steering pressure gauge, which I may end up doing. But before I do that, before I go and rent one of those from the store or purchase one, what I thought I might try is these GM Saginaw pumps have a removable pressure valve on the back of the pump. I'm going to drain the fluid from the system and then pull that valve out, get a look at it, see if it might be sticking or binding. There might be some issue there. If I find something, hopefully I can clean it up, put it back together, and everything's great. If not, well, I'll go seek out that pressure gauge and take things from there. And by the way, with the pressure gauge, you hook it in line to the high pressure line of the power steering system. There's a valve on that pressure gauge that you can block off flow. And you only want to do this momentarily, like for a few seconds, but you do it 3 times in a row. You're looking for somewhere around 1100 PSI, and you want it to consistently read the same amount of pressure whenever you're blocking it off. If it doesn't and it begins to drop down, then suspect a problem with the pump. If you have proper pressure and you still have difficult steering, start looking towards the steering box or steering rack. I have more permanently mounted the new location of the power steering rack. There's a fastener down here that I added to it. It seems to be securely fastened, and I'm actually pretty happy with this here. The stock power steering cooler runs up into this frame rail, if you're curious about that. The way I'm draining the system is that I'm just disconnecting that line there, that lower line. That's the return line going back to the reservoir. It also goes to the reservoir, so I just hold that down, and that's a very nice way to drain all the power steering fluid very neatly. All right, here's a look at my power steering fluid draining. I'm gonna drain into this container because let's just say synthetic power steering fluid is expensive. I wanna try and save it because this is like $20 worth of power steering fluid. And by the way, taking the cap off of the power steering reservoir will allow it to drain better and faster. So I just got this off loosely like that. While that's draining the rest of the way out, here's a look at that valve that I'm talking about. Follow the high pressure power steering line, which is the line you're looking at now. What it screws into, that nut, is the valve. Now I'm going to remove that high pressure line. On this one, there's an O-ring on the end of it, so make sure that that doesn't go away. You'll need it. Actually, that is the valve. And that is the spring. I'm not seeing or feeling anything in these parts that jumps out and says, I'm your problem. Could be some scoring or some burrs on this outer part of the valve here. I'm gonna open it up. The spring is not broken. Doesn't appear to be bent or binding. I don't really see anything. I'm gonna try to clean out, maybe hit with some compressed air, all these little holes and these little valves. I'm gonna take this piece off. I'm just gonna see if I can get away with this using an impact to knock this off, because I don't want any damage to any of this on the outside here. But although, if I look closely, I do see some scoring. Is that causing that to bind when it heats up? I don't know. Check valve. Spring. And then this guy, which is the housing for all of it. And I literally do not see any issues at all. So I'm just gonna clean all these parts up. I've got some brake clean here. So Eric, what happens if this isn't successful? Well, then I go looking for a pump, because that would mean the veins or something like that inside the pump is having a problem. The only thing I could possibly see is that little spot on that screen. I mean, you can see daylight through it just fine. So I know there's flow through it, but at this point I'm grasping at straws. This is a piece of croker's cloth. I'm just gonna try to remove some of the rough edges here. And I realize I probably should have done this before I put the valve back together, but I'll clean it out again one last time. Let's put this back on, top off the system, see what we got. It'll go back together the reverse of how it came apart. The spring, the valve goes in first. And I probably should have mentioned this. There's an O-ring that's on this that also needs to be intact. It would leak if it wasn't, but I think you got it apart. You might as well check it. Let's put the fluid back in it. I just looked in the bottom of this just for the heck of it, looking for like shiny metal bits that would indicate like maybe a pump failure or something. I don't really see it. Maybe you do, but I don't. As long as we're here, we can do a quick cold startup and test. Just like it normally is cold. It's fine. I don't see any leaks. Well, whatever you saw in the last clip didn't work. And I've taken a break and reached out to J&B Tool Sales, who has hooked me up with a power steering pressure gauge, which I have installed onto the power steering system. It's in series. I just put it down there in where the high pressure line goes in. And like I said, it's just in series. And there's this valve here that you can close, that we will close, that simulates a full lock or sends everything into full pressure. We're going to be looking for, I believe, about 1100 PSI when it's choked off down here. But the real test, I think, will be after I let the engine warm up for a bit and then recheck things just to see if there's a difference in the pressure output. I suspect it's a bad pump, but if we have correct pressures, then that means that we got a problem with the steering box, because that's the only part of the system. Everything else, the hoses and everything, is new, so it should work. I just rechecked the spec. It's 80 to 125 PSI just normally sitting there with no load on it. Then when you restrict it, you're supposed to do it 3 times in a row. They're all supposed to be within 50 PSI of each other, and then it's 1100 to 1200 PSI is what it should top out at. If it starts to degrade during those three pressure stresses that you put on the system, then they say that the pressure control valve is probably the issue. If pressure is high just when I start it up, that means there's likely a restriction in the line somewhere. But let's start it up and see what we have on this truck. We're looking for 80 to 125 PSI on startup while it runs.
So we're looking at maybe 175-ish, 150, I believe here. So now I will restrict it to see where it goes. Okay, so that's the restriction and it's going down to 0.
You ever have one of those days where you're just not as smart as you think you are? Well, it happens to me quite often. And those astute viewers watching the last clip that may have used these before may have noticed what I did. I didn't notice it until I was putting the tool away. Let me show you. Well, last time I had this gauge hooked up incorrectly. I now have it hooked up correctly. And what I had done before was I had taken a line coming out of the power steering pump that would be going into the power steering box and had it coming into this side. Therefore, what would happen when I closed the valve is all the pressure would stop right here, so it's no wonder the gauge would read 0. I now have it hooked up to where this feed line is coming in from the pump, and when I close this valve off right here, it will send pressure up to the gauge. So now it's hooked up correctly, and if you don't hook it up correctly, every power steering pump you diagnose is going to be bad. So be sure that you have the pressure coming in and it's able to point towards the gauge. If not, well, you're not going to get a correct reading.
You can see the pressure is already different. It's, well, I'd call that 250. Let's close it off, see what happens. So the whole time my arm was up here touching this and it was burning. But I ran it 3 times, but you could see that needle was all over the place. I'm still going to condemn the pump because we never really got a definitive 1100 PSI reading. It was going all over the place. If I were to hazard a guess, I'd say like 1 or 2 of the vanes inside the pump is broken or bad. I still believe it's a bad pump, but it's super important that the gauge gets hooked up correctly. That's why I put this in. Check it out, it's even worse after it warms up. Yeah, I can't seem to put anything out.
Make sure you have the gauge hooked up correctly, but it was clear that I wasn't getting 1100 PSI, not even close to it. And when it was cold, I got a bouncy needle. When it warmed up, like I said, I didn't even get close to 1100 PSI. So I am certain that the power steering pump is bad at this point. Now let's go find one and put it on. Check it out, new power steering pump. I actually purchased this one. I'm gonna take the other one off. If I'm able to warranty that one, great, but this solves the problem and allows me to finish this video. I'm not too worried about having an extra one of these pumps because, well, this one failed pretty quickly. But as it happens, the Ford also uses this same power steering pump. So if I have an extra one, I have an extra one for 2 vehicles and not just one. I'm not gonna cover the details of installing this. I'm just going to install it, fill it up with fluid, and then we'll check things out when I'm done. Hopefully this works. This is the old pump, and something that I noticed actually while editing the first part of this video was on startup, this pulley seemed to wobble, and I wanted to confirm it off the truck. So I have the screwdriver laid up here as sort of a frame of reference. The screwdriver is remaining stationary, but you can see how the pulley is moving around. And I wonder if that contributed to its failure. I'm also wondering if that's part of the pulley or if the shaft is bent. I'd be okay if the shaft was bent, but if there's a problem with the pulley, I'm afraid it might destroy my new pump. Let's hope that's not the case. You know, one thing that's cool about universal pumps like this Saginaw is that, as I mentioned, I have the same one on the Ford. That means that really just a matter of changing out the pressure valve. So I'm going to make sure that mine is the same or similar to this one. If it's not, I'm just going to take this one over here and put it into here. I think we've eliminated any problems or possible problems with the pressure valve. See, this one's got a different inlet. Maybe be able to see that there. So I'm going to have to change that over in order to make this work on my application, but really it's just a matter of swapping the stuff out. In fact, it may just be a question of swapping out this end piece. That's a 1-inch, in case you were wondering. See, it has the exact same valve as the other one. And I might just leave this in here because they're the same. I might just change this outer piece. And there's the spring. Yeah, their height and the look of them is the same. Valves also look the same. Springs are the same height and they look like they have the same coloration. Because of the similarities, this is my new pump, this is my old pump. I'm gonna throw some stuff on the floor, get it all dirty before I install it. I'm kidding, I'm gonna clean this up. So I'm gonna take the new valve, put it in the new pump. Well, first I'm gonna put the spring in, because the spring sits on it like this, by the way. So while it's in there, I don't know if I showed this earlier, this is how it sits in there. And you're gonna take all the same stuff, put it in. That doesn't feel right. It's not by much, but there is a slight difference. You can see it there. See a little bit of daylight. So I'm going to install my old valve and everything in the new pump. Beginning to call into question this entire thing. I mean, that was only a couple thousands, but it's feeling like a lot more here. I'm thinking about doing another video, taking this apart, finding out what went wrong. Really, this video sort of took a left turn a long time ago. It's a bad pulley. See how it's moving in and out? That's a pulley problem. If I'm to guess, I'm going to say that this could have been the cause of the failure to begin with. Causing a vibration in the shaft, perhaps wrecking the pump. Reach out to this manufacturer. This is a March performance setup. And see what they say about that. It's ready to go back on. New power steering pump is installed and full of fluid. The belt is on and tensioned. I have also left the pressure gauge back on the system just because I'm curious what a new good pump works like. Also, it will allow me to verify that switching my valve over didn't cause any issues. So let's start it up, see if we got power steering, and then we'll check those pressures. Then we'll warm it up, and then we'll check those temperatures across the system, just for funsies. No leaks, zero pressure. Maybe my valve switcheroo didn't work as well as I'd hoped. I've taken the parts out just to get a look at them and do actual measurements. So the new valve or plug in the end of the pump, whatever we want to call this, is 167. The old one is 168, so it's really negligible. Old valve, 136. New valve, 137. So we're literally only talking about a couple of thousandths of an inch. Maybe try the shorter valve. Hopefully I'll be able to get this sorted. Well, somewhere in there, I lost the batteries to my microphone and audio along with it. So I'll catch you up about what I've done up to this point. I have gone in and I've put the old pressure valve in the new power steering pump, and now I do have pressure. In fact, operating pressure, I believe, is somewhere just shy of 300 PSI. So that's encouraging. The old pump, I think, wouldn't even do 200 PSI. I went ahead and did the block off where I ran that valve closed to see what maximum pressure output could be. One thing that I found interesting is as I was doing that, the needle didn't bounce around as it did with the old pump, which I'm certain is bad at this point. But it did reach 1100 PSI, so I know we're good there. I've since put everything back together. I'm gonna go out and take it for a drive, warm it up, come back, check to make sure that everything's good, and then we'll ship it from there. Just for the heck of it, I'll also run the thermal camera over everything, including the new cooler, just to see how things are looking, because I'm curious and you might be too. Anyway, I think we got this thing solved. All right, I'm back from my test drive, I'm warmed up, and I got power steering for days. All better. Very happy it's all better. Like, actual power steering now. Ah, so happy. Let's see what it looks like on the thermal. We'll start with the laser. Outlet, high pressure for the pump, 178. Inlet, 179, 180. Inlet to the steering box, about 175, 6. Outlet from the steering box, 171. Here's what's going on inside the cooler. Real quick before I close this out, let's run down the things to check if you have a power steering issue in your vehicle. Number one thing to check is your tire pressures. If your tire pressures are low, it's going to be more difficult to steer, so make sure your tire pressures are up to spec. Also, sort of number one is check the fluid level and condition. If the fluid's low, obviously top it off. But if there's any air in that fluid, that could indicate the problem, because air in a hydraulic system is not good. So track down the source of that and you'll likely solve the power steering problem that you have. Also on fluid, some manufacturers are very specific about the type of fluid that goes into their system, so make sure that you're using the fluid that is recommended for your system. I know Hondas in particular, if you use anything but Honda power steering fluid, there's oftentimes issues, at least in my experience. So I only use Honda power steering fluid and Honda power steering systems. However, this truck, with his old Saginaw pump, I use the synthetic fluid, and I do feel that that made a positive difference. So if you have an older system like this and you want it to work a little better, consider synthetic fluid. And as far as fluid goes, maybe change it out every 50,000 miles or so, or whenever you're servicing the system. This is an often neglected fluid, and if you put new stuff in there, it goes a long way towards helping it last a long time. And I can't forget about checking the power steering belt and its tension, because that's critical. If you don't spin the power steering pump, well, it's not going to work properly. Common sense, right? Also check the suspension components for bent, broken, or damaged parts that could cause a steering issue. Lastly, check the linkage that goes between the steering wheel and the power steering box or power steering rack. I have found issues in, like, say, U-joints binding in those situations, causing difficult or just weird problems while you're steering. Anyway, that's a list of things for you to check out. Now we'll close this video out. Well, I'm going to call that a win, albeit a long, strange trip to get here for sure. I started out thinking I needed a power steering cooler and ended up needing a power steering pump. And I'm hoping that the process that I went through in this video helps you better understand power steering systems and helps you diagnose a problem you may have with your system. Now, that cooler is working. And I checked the inlet and outlet temperatures. I couldn't quite see being under the truck with a camera and everything, but inlet temperature I think was somewhere around 160 something, and outlet temperature was around 120 something. So even under the bumper, not getting a whole lot of airflow, I'm getting, just out of the engine compartment, I'm getting about 40 degrees of cooling through that cooler. I don't consider that a bad thing, mainly because I'm not a fan of chrome, especially for accessory drive stuff. Now, why did I do it? Well, it was an easy solution for all the accessories on the front of this engine, because I redid everything. I had the air conditioning, I had the alternator, I had the power steering, everything I needed. But chrome is an insulator, it holds in heat, so perhaps adding that power steering cooler helped that power steering system out, and hopefully that pump will last a lot longer. We'll see about my warranty pump. I'll see about taking this one apart and maybe finding out what went wrong with it. It won't be bad to have an extra pump around because, like I said, the Ford has the same thing. That one has a power steering cooler on it. I've never had a problem with that Saginaw pump. I don't know. Good luck finding one of those pressure testers. I will say that. I went to 4 different local auto parts stores. None of them have one that I could rent. I actually ended up having to get one from J&B Tool Sales. I'll link that down in the description. As far as, you know, the approach to power steering systems, a lot of times people just shotgun it and say, well, it's not working. Pump's easy to replace. Let's throw a pump on it, see what happens. Had I done that, I'd have been done already, but I wouldn't have this cool video for you, which I hope the information in it was useful. If you have questions beyond this video, well, first check the description. I'll link parts, tools, things like that, useful information. But I will also put a link to EricTheCarGuy.com if you have automotive questions not covered in this video, which is where I ask you go. Tons of resources there for you to help you with automotive issues. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share the video with the world. Appreciate it when you do that. Be safe, have fun, stay dirty. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you next time.